Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this first lecture of the lecture series of the Institute of Jewish Studies. After several years, we did have some lectures in person last year, but they were all also live streamed and hybrid, and we decided to just go for it and do this in person only, which we weren't sure about. You know, people have their habits, and after years of just being on Zoom and then thinking that one can just as well stay at home and see the same thing, well, it's certainly not the same thing, and it's a great, great pleasure to welcome you here, indeed, in person and live. So, good evening, everybody. This is indeed the first lecture of our lecture series 2022-23, and so the Institute was opened in 2001, so we are entering our 23rd year. That's correct. I particularly welcome both our Institute's audience as well as the esteemed participants to the workshop on Talmud and contemporary thought, of which this evening and this lecture are part of the program. I would like to warmly thank the speaker of today, Professor Annabel Herzog, whom I will introduce for having accepted our invitation to speak on the topic of Levinas' reading of the Talmud. And I feel greatly honored that Annabel is here. She wrote one of the important books on Jewish philosophy in the past years, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce her, and she will talk about her book, but from a very specific point of view that is indeed part of this workshop that is going on now. Professor Annabel Herzog is Professor of Political Theory and the head of the Cultural Studies program at the School of Political Science at the University of Haifai, Israel. She's the editor of Hannah Arendt, Totalitarisme et Banalité du Mal, published at the Presse Universitaire de France in 2011. The author of Penser autrement la politique, 1997, of Levinas' Politics, Justice, Mercy, Universality, University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020, and of many essays on ethics, politics, and hermeneutics. Her research focuses on the work of 20th century philosophers such as Emmanuel Levinas, Hannah Arendt, and Jacques Derrida, on contemporary Jewish philosophy, on the relation between philosophy and literature, on the dystopian imagination, on trauma and memory, and on the relation between ethics and politics. Very important, Annabel's book won the Jewish Book Award of
Jordan Schnitzer.
The Jordan Schnitzer Award in Jewish philosophy of 2021, which is one of the important book prizes in Jewish thought and humanities, Jewish humanities as such. Annabel has been a long-time friend, and I've been waiting for her to come here and give this opening lecture for our lecture series. I'm very pleased. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian, and thank you for your incredible hospitality as usual. It's always a pleasure to come back to Antwerp. And thank you, Jan, where are you? You're here. Thank you for organizing everything so well, as usual. So it's not my first time, and as usual, everything is perfect. So thank you very much. And thank you all for being here tonight. I already talked with some of you, because I was here quite early, and some of you were too, so I already exchanged some life stories. But it's very nice to see you, and I'm happy that this in-person series is starting again, and I hope that you will have many more years of such important and interesting meetings. I mean, the other ones, I don't know about mine. And thank you also to Elad for inviting me to be part of the Talmud and Contemporary Thought workshop. My daughter is 29 and she lives in Tel Aviv. For a few years, she has volunteered to teach Hebrew to the African and Asian political refugees and work immigrants who live in very precarious conditions in the southern part of the city. My point this evening is not about the refugees or her teaching, which is admirable and heroic even. But I want to talk about something else. To teach her class, my daughter crosses one of the poorest and most miserable parts of Tel Aviv, where refugees, homeless, and drug addicts populate the streets. She told me that when she walks among all the beggars, she has two kinds of reactions. Sometimes she thinks. She rationalizes what she sees. She asks herself, can these people be helped? They look beyond hope. Would giving them something ameliorate their situation? Their minds and bodies seem helplessly destroyed by the substances they use. With my money, she thinks, they will certainly buy more drugs. Should I give them something anyway? Will it make a difference? Some other times, she does not think at all. She told me, you see a begging hand, you put money in it. Why should you care about the use of that money? When there's a demand, you fulfill it. It's none of your business if the person buys drugs, alcohol, or food, or support their kids' education. It's irrelevant. The only thing that counts is the open hand. You see that hand, you give, before starting to think. These two possible reactions, these two levels of experience, are exactly the two levels of experience described in Levinas's philosophy under the terms politics and ethics. I suppose that some of you have heard of the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas was a phenomenologist, which means that he described the structures of experience or consciousness. It also means that his philosophy does not describe what is or should be from a neutral point of view. Rather, Levinas describes from a first-person perspective what happens to consciousness, the way we experience things, the meaning things have in our experience. In that context, Levinas is known for his radical and extreme ethical philosophy, which puts the accent on the infinite responsibility that the subject, the I, the ego, has for the other, that is, for any other person. This ethics is extreme and sometimes seems too abstract for the real world. Are we really taking full responsibility for everyone and everything? Is it really what happens? Is it really what ethics is about? If so, how to understand the relationship between ethics and real life, that is politics, in Levinas? Levinas is also known for his Jewish work, his interpretations of the Talmud, which he published in parallel to his philosophy. Here too, we wonder, are these texts some kind of Jewish hobby, some weekend activity that he indulged in the margins of his serious philosophical work? Is it an illustration of his philosophy, how to understand the relationship between Levinas's philosophy and his reading of the Talmud. As I said, some of you know Levinas very well. For those who do not, I will briefly come back to the main elements of his life and his work. And I will try to answer the two questions that I just raised. How to understand the relationship between ethics and politics in Levinas. How to understand the relationship between his philosophy and his reading of the Talmud. Sorry. A few biographical elements first. Levinas was born in Lithuania in 1906. He studied philosophy at the University of Strasbourg. He spent the academic year 1928-1929 in Freiburg, where he studied with Husserl and Heidegger. Returning to France, he completed and published his dissertation on the theory of intuition in Husserl's Phenomenology, a book that introduced Sartre and the French philosophical audience to Husserl's phenomenology, and through this, transformed European philosophy. During the 1930s, he was in contact with the Parisian philosophical avant-garde. He studied Hegel with Kojève and became a close friend of Maurice Blanchot. Levinas was mobilized in the French army in 1939, but in 1940 he was captured and sent to a forced labor camp for military prisoners in Germany. His wife and daughter were hidden by French friends, while his Lithuanian relatives and those of his wife were murdered in what became known as the Holocaust. After the war, he became director of the École Normale Israélite Orientale, l'ENIO, a teacher training college that served bright young men and women from Jewish schools in the Mediterranean basin. His early works, Existence and Existence, Time and the Other, and Discovering Existence with Husserl and Heidegger, appeared in the late 1940s, around the time he was studying Talmud with the mysterious Monsieur Shoushani, who also taught Elie Wiesel and others, and about whom a few books have been published in the last years. Levinas later published a series of Talmudic commentaries interspersed among his most famous philosophical books. Totality and Infinity, his first philosophical masterpiece, appeared in 1961. 4 Talmudic readings in 1968. Otherwise Than Being, or Being on Essence, his second major philosophical book in 1974. From the Sacred to the Holy in 1977, etc. Levinas was appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Poitiers in 1964, then at the University of Paris-Nanterre, and finally in 1973 at the Sorbonne University of Paris 4. He died in Paris in December 25, 1995. Levinas's philosophy focuses on the meeting between the thinking subject and the other, namely any other person. This encounter has two dimensions. On the one hand, subjectivity thinks and hence identifies and acknowledges the other as a person. On the other hand, in the moment of the meeting, without thinking about it, subjectivity is destabilized or overflowed or even torn away by the otherness of the other person. Levinas's philosophy is a description of that destabilization and of the difference between it and the recognition of the other as a person. Levinas calls the dimension of recognition ontology, which means what is related to being, what concerns anything that is. And the dimension of destabilization ethics, which means for Levinas anything that's related to responsibility. On the ontological level, the subject is a consciousness that uses concepts to categorize what it perceives in order to understand the world. Thus, when I meet the other, when the ego meets someone, he or she classifies her in many categories. This person has a body, opinions, behavior, a history, etc. On the ethical level, however, the ego encounters in the other person something unique that cannot be reduced to categories, that cannot be thought. In the face of the other, says Levinas, is revealed something unique that is ungraspable. Levinas calls it alterity, transcendence, infinity, or the trace of God. On the ontological level, the subject wants to be. Therefore, the thinking ego is a surviving ego, open to all means, including violence, to continue to be. For Levinas, there's an equivalence between reducing singularity or uniqueness to general categories and using or even abusing all that is perceived, including human beings, in order to continue to be. Therefore, the alterity or uniqueness revealed in the face of the other is a vulnerability that can be destroyed by an ontological ego who seeks to classify and dominate in order to be. Levinas, however, claims that this vulnerability disturbs and interrupts the ontological survival by giving subjectivity the order to accept the other, to protect her, not to kill her. In the fleeting moments of the meeting with another person, the ego tries to understand this person, to subjugate her, to kill her. But it also receives the order not to do so. This order is a call to responsibility for the other. It is ethical. Levinas's understanding of responsibility evolves from his early texts to his later one. In his early text, he merely argues that the ontological impulse of comprehension and possession is not the only dimension of the meeting between the ego and the other. In essays published in the 1960s, however, and in Totality and Infinity, he emphasizes further three fundamental elements. First, there is a gap between the ontological impulse and the ethical command. The order of responsibility for alterity comes first, not in terms of chronology, but in terms of importance and value. Second, the ethical relation is asymmetrical. Because of his infinite needs, the vulnerable other is counterintuitively also a master and lord. In his weakness and destitution, he resists and commands the ego. Thirdly, the ethical subjectivity is depicted as a host who welcomes the soliciting other in his house and in his thought. In his second masterpiece, Otherwise Than Being, and in later texts, Levinas pushes these three elements to their uttermost signification. The interruption of the ontological impulse becomes an absolute dislocation of subjectivity. The openness to alterity defines the structure of subjectivity a priori, before subjectivity establishes its own identity, and before it meets the other. In a rhetorical crescendo that has become associated with Levinas's writing style, ethical responsibility is portrayed as so total that the subject is no more a host, but has become hostage. Levinas reaches the maximum of his emphatic pathos when he argues that the ego is responsible for his persecutor. Some readers of Levinas have rejected this claim and contended, like Hilary Putnam, that it is very hard to argue that I am responsible to the point of responsibility for my own persecution. Levinas's position, however, is not that a person is responsible for his or her own persecution, but that responsibility is a form of persecution which constitutes subjectivity. In such a context of ethical sacrifice, the ego's ontological impulse seems to have disappeared. Does the ego not think and categorize when he or she is defined as pure responsibility for the other? He or she certainly does, but Levinas understands ontology as another dimension of the meeting, another kind of meeting, that between the ego, the other, and the third party. From this moment on, ontology can be called politics. If ethics describes the immediate encounter between the ego and the other, politics will be the mediation between three people or more. In the presence of a third party who, like the other, has needs, nothing can be absolute or transcendent. Everything must be thought and calculated. What do I owe the third party when I already owe everything to the other? What do the other and the third owe each other? While the ethical relationship constitutes a command of absolute responsibility for the other, the relation between the ego and several others leads to a calculation and distributions of duties and rights. Let us emphasize here that the third party is not a particular person. It's a structure of experience, the situation of there being more than two points of view. The third party is a metaphor, indicating that instead of sacrifice, there must be assessment and organization of conflicting interests. The third party, however, is always there. He looks at me in the eyes of the other, says Levinas. This means that the existence of the other attests to the existence of others. It also means that in the eyes of the other, the ego sees herself and her own needs. In the meeting with the other, the ego is an ethical subjectivity sacrificing herself, but she is also always a third party, calculating her own shares of duties and rights. Ethics and politics constantly interfere with each other, challenge each other. To come back to my daughter. Faced to a beggar's open hand, she had ontological, that is, political reactions. She reflected on the beggar's situation and calculated his needs. She compared them to her own needs. She tried to determine if she could help, if she wanted to help, and how. She tried to grasp, to organize and control the situation. She wanted to make sense of what she saw, to translate the beggar's demand into a meaningful narrative, into a specific problem that needed solutions. However, she also had an ethical reaction before thinking, before understanding, before comparing her situation with that of the beggar. She was compelled, commanded almost, by the begging hands to give them something. My daughter's story fits Levinas so well because he himself used the image of the beggar to explain his ethics, which, however, describes the structures of experience in all meetings with human beings and not only with poor people. In other words, the situation that my daughter described is for Levinas paradigmatic of all human encounters. On the ethical level, the ego is immediately compelled to responsibility for the other. On the political level, the ego calculates duties and rights. I'd like to give you another example, an example not related to my daughter, to concretize the two levels of experience described by Levinas. Imagine that you live in a house, not an apartment, in a big building in the city, but in a house. There are, grass outside. Your home, it's a winter night, cold and raining, very dark. You're home with your family and friends. Everyone's there. Try to imagine the situation. Everyone's home. You're not waiting for anyone. Everyone's already there. You cooked something tasty. Maybe tasty and satisfying. Maybe soup. Maybe homemade pizza. There's a very good smell in the house. Lots of lights, warmth, food, people. Outside it's dark, cold and rainy. Suddenly there's a ring at the door. Now focus on that moment. There's a ring at the door. Focus on that moment. that feeling, your consciousness at that very moment when you hear the bell. Again, you're inside, it's warm, outside it's cold. Inside there's food, outside it's dark. Inside you're with your friends, outside you don't know who's there. Focus on that very moment. The bell is a disturbance. You have everything inside and it's warm. You don't really need to open that door. Opening the door means facing a demand, not necessarily a homeless, but someone who wants something from you. That's why they rang the bell. In any case, opening the door is giving your warmth and tranquility to someone else. Opening the door means facing a threat, losing something of yourself. Opening the door is also an injunction. The bell rang, you open the door. So your consciousness is divided between keeping everything inside and opening yourself to the outside, to darkness and cold. Not opening the door or opening and quickly closing, oh, don't need anything, closing back. This is the ontological level of consciousness. The level that says, this person outside needs maybe this or that, but certainly does not need everything from you. Opening the door is the ethical level, the sacrifice through which subjectivity becomes itself. But if so, the problem that comes to view when we ask all these questions and when we describe these situations is that ethics and politics seem to, the question that must be asked is that of the relation between ethical responsibility and socio-political organization. How do they interact with each other? Do they affect each other at all? The problem that comes to view when we ask these questions is that ethics and politics seems to undermine each other, to neutralize each other. As we just saw, ethics is the structure of relationship between the ego and the other, in which the ego is infinitely responsible for the other. It appears as a transcendent order perceived by the ego. It cannot be explained. It's simply there. The meeting with the other makes me responsible. Politics, on the other hand, is the structure of relationships between the ego and many others, in which duties and rights must be calculated. It's a situation that can be planned, discussed, organized, and modified. But one cannot be... I think I forgot this one. Yeah. But one cannot be at the same time infinitely responsible and responsible in a calculated measure. The structure of the meeting cannot be at the same time immediate and mediate. As it seems, therefore, there's an opposition or even a contradiction between the ethical and the political levels of experience. As it seems, ethics is cancelled by politics, and politics is cancelled by ethics. This would be already complicated enough without the following addition. Ethics and politics, says Levinas, always occur together. We cannot have one without the other, and we cannot not have them. There is no pure ethics, and there is no pure politics. There's always and ineluctably an ethical responsibility in the middle of a socio-political reality. The structure of impersonal relations is therefore antinomic or self-contradictory, antinomic and not antinomian, which means something totally different. So it is not Levinas, but another philosopher, his friend and disciple, Jacques Derrida, who put the accent on the antinomic relationship between ethics and politics in Levinas's philosophy. And after explaining Levinas's antinomic structure, Derrida used it a lot in his own philosophy, but first he defined it, he described it in Levinas's philosophy. Ethics and politics are together in an antinomic relationship or aporetic relationship, namely an internal contradiction. How does that work? How do two domains that cancel each other function together? Let us come back to my daughter. We could argue that she explained how it works. As she said, sometimes she's in an ethical mood and she gives money, and sometimes she's in a political mood and she does not give money. But this would be a very wrong interpretation of the situation. Indeed, in her case, like in all cases, ethics and politics are not that clearly separated. It's not that ethics gives and politics does not give. Politics is about comparison, organization, distribution, and retribution. Therefore, it deals with most aspects of our social life: housing, health, food, education. Politics is not about not giving, but about rationalizing and organizing giving and not giving. Ethics, on the other hand, is the immediate impulse of responsibility. Thus, it's not that one is sometimes ethical and sometimes political. One is always disturbed by an ethical impulse of responsibility, and one always moderates it in different ways, with political justification and distribution. Inversely, one always thinks in terms of justification and distribution, but the ethical impulse is always there to remind us that the other is vulnerable and that we are responsible for her beyond all rational policies. Surprisingly, Levinas deals with these questions very, very little in his phenomenological publications. There he mainly indicates that ethics and politics contradict and disturb each other. What I showed in my last book, however, is that it is in his commentaries on Talmudic sources that he develops these questions at length. Now, Levinas's Talmudic readings have engendered many debates and a vast corpus of scholarship, which is, however, relatively new. Until a few years ago, most readers of Levinas focused on his philosophical books, turning occasionally to the Talmudic commentaries for an illustration. Later on, scholars in religious studies, Jewish studies, and the history of ideas became interested in his Talmudic interpretations, called by Levinas these Talmudic readings. Some see Levinas as a Jewish exegete in the tradition of famous rabbis. Others focus on his impact on the reconstruction of the French Jewish community in the second half of the 20th century, namely in the wake of the trauma of the Holocaust. Others even regard him as one of the thinkers responsible for a renewal of theological concerns in the secularized Judeo-Christian world. All these perspectives are interesting and important. My understanding of the Talmudic readings, however, is that they manifest a political thinking that challenges the ethical analysis offered in Levinas's phenomenological works, or more exactly, that they offer practical developments of the antinomy of ethics and politics. This is so because the Talmud examines the law in the light of particular cases. The Talmud confronts the apodictic law expressed in the Bible and then in the Mishnah with concrete situations, which are often fictional and sometimes completely unrealistic, yet are more concrete than the original law. As such, the Talmud does not merely explain the law, but deconstructs it, tests it, reinforces it, and sometimes overturns it. Likewise, Levinas's Talmudic readings reinforce and confront the ethical call to responsibility described in his phenomenological books, with particular situations. Levinas called this method paradigmatic modality. His Talmudic readings ask the question, what does ethic mean in situations that involve more than the ego and the others? What does ethics mean, therefore, in concrete situations that are, by definition, non-ethical? Levinas chose not to take his examples from contemporary everyday life, but to borrow cases drawn by the rabbis from the everyday life of their time or from their imagination. He uses these cases to give new meaning to 20th century events and phenomena such as the Shoah, revolutionary Marxism, or the development of liberalism. For Levinas, these cases became paradigms In other words, in his Talmudic readings, Levinas uses the cases analyzed by the rabbis of the Talmud to test his ethics in situations that, like all empirical situations, are not purely ethical. Namely, to speak in Levinasian language, situations in which a meeting of 3 points of view is superimposed on the meeting between two. Here I need to make a few things clear. Levinas read the Talmud and other Jewish sources in an original way. He was neither a rabbi, nor a Talmudist rabbi, nor a scholar of the Talmud. For him, reading the Talmud was a philosophical exercise, and his commentaries are philosophical products. In fact, Levinas never uses or explains the traditional rabbinic method, despite occasional comments on the context and method throughout the Talmudic readings and the introductions to these books. To put it differently, Levinas's project is not to make rabbinic literature accessible to a wide audience, but to use this literature to say what he wants to say, using his own style. Now, the legitimacy of such an approach can be debated, but it's not our purpose to debate tonight. Rather, I will give you an example of how Levinas uses the Talmud to describe and to try to solve the antinomy of ethics and politics. My focus is only on Levinas's reading of the Talmud, not on the Talmud per se, or on the orthodoxy of Levinas's reading. So let's take a look at the Talmudic reading called Judaism and Revolution. Judaism and Revolution is a commentary of a discussion found in the Talmudic tractate Baba Metzia, folio 83 AB, about working hours and the treatment of workers. Thus, it should be already very clear that we are immersed in a very concrete situation. We're talking about working hours and the treatment of workers. The Mishnah, that is the law, quoted in Baba Metzia 83a, decrees that working hours and workers' meals should be regulated by local custom, namely, neither by arbitrary will nor by universal law. The Mishnah declares, he who hires workers and tells them to begin early and finish late cannot force them, if beginning early and finishing late does not conform to the custom of the place. Where the custom is that they be fed, he is obligated to feed them. Where it is that they be served dessert, he must serve them desserts. That's the Mishnah. The phrase conform to the custom of the place means that local custom limits the employer's generosity as much as his power, as is clear from a later part of the Mishnah, which holds that promises to workers are also restricted by the custom of the place. Workers may expect neither less nor more than what custom dictates. Understanding the text as being only and strictly oriented towards workers' welfare, Levinas infers that the Mishnah is concerned with the rights of the other person. What Levinas means by the other person is that in the Mishnaic text, the workers are considered not in terms of their objective status as persons or citizens, but in terms of their relationship with the I or ego of the text, the employer. That is, the text, according to Levinas, is concerned with how we treat those with whom we subjectively perceive to be outside ourselves and whom we accordingly regard as others. Indeed, the phenomenological assumption that lies as the origin of the expression the other is that the reference is always the subject who perceives the other. In this context, Levinas's argument is that the Mishnaic ruling is not a general law about free, rational, and responsible members of the community, but a law about the people that the subject perceives as his or her exteriority. That is, the law depends on the fact that people perceive others and turn toward them. Turning towards others, or intentionality in phenomenological language, lies at the basis of ethical responsibility for the other. In Levinas's thought, the ego is responsible for the other in all cases, and in particular, if the other is in a lower material position. As such, up to this point, Levinas seems to use the Talmud to describe what he conceptualized as the ethical situation. There are two parties, employer and employees. The first has power and the other is poor. Consequently, the worker's face expresses a demand that is a command, and the employer is infinitely responsible for him. The Mishnah, however, continue with the story. Rabbi Yochanan ben Mattia asked his son to hire workers. The son promised food to the workers. When he came back, his father said, "Even if you prepared a meal for them equal to the one King Solomon served, you would not have fulfilled your obligation toward them, for they are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as long as they have not begun to work. Go and specify, you are only entitled to bread and legumes." The Mishnah here can be understood in a simple and practical way. Be precise in your contracts, because if you are not, you risk a potential dispute. If you vaguely promise food to your workers, your workers may demand a big steak and chips, arguing that that's what they understood by food, or that's what they used to receive from their previous employer, or that is what they need for dietary or religious reasons. As the father tells his son, even a feast worthy of King Solomon would never be enough. Therefore, the Mishnah insists, since the father and son obviously cannot afford a meal fit for kings, they must make clear that the workers will receive the minimum prescribed by custom, bread and legumes. In my interpretation of Levinas' text, Levinas focuses on this story to illustrate the antinomic relationship between ethics and politics. At the beginning, we had two parties, the employer and the employees, the former being responsible for the latter. The employer, however, has now been divided into two. The employer comprised a father and a son who have individual desires and opinions. These divisions between different opinions is in itself the manifestation of a third party. Crucially, the third party is none of the three in particular. It's neither the father nor the son, nor the workers who play here the role of the other. Rather, the third party consists of the very condition of there being three voices in the story. The infinite demand of the workers, perceived by the father and exposed in his conversation with his son, generates the question of the limit and sharing of responsibility. The employer is not only defined by his responsibility for the welfare of the workers, he is also defined by his own interest in his own welfare, or that of his family, or that indeed of any other people. He must calculate what he can give to the worker other. But what does this story and Levinas's understanding of it tell us beyond what my daughter told me? And that is that there are two levels of experience in human relationship. Seen from a Levinasian perspective, this Talmudic story tells us two things. First, it shows that ethical responsibility is the core of all relationships in a context in which all relationships already exist. It's not a pre-political situation, but that which gives meaning to the actual phenomenal political situation. Second, it reveals the difference between ethics as an infinite, or at least vague and open-ended promise, and politics as the calculation of what is possible. Levinas says that the solution to this problem is a contract, like the contract in the Talmudic story under which the workers are entitled not to food with an open-ended definition, but to some kind of food. Within the bounds of this contract, Levinas insists that this food must be a decent human meal, not food typically given to slaves or fit for animals. That is, the workers are entitled to meals that respect them as human beings. In using the vocabulary of the contract, a vocabulary that he takes from Hobbes, and other philosophers of the social contract, Levinas clarifies the relationship between ethics and politics. The worker's right correspond to the ethical command in the face of the other. Like Hobbes' natural right, they are anterior to all human agreement. However, the contract, which, as in all contract narratives, follows the statement of rights, is the only guarantee of these rights. A natural right exists before any contract, but cannot be fulfilled without a contract. Ethics, that is, the worker's demand to receive undefined and therefore unlimited food, is not phenomenally anterior to the contract that promises some food, but not any food, and not any quantity of food. The worker's unlimited right to food cannot be implemented before being limited by a contract that stipulates what kind of food and how much food will be offered. In other words, ethics appears in the form of rights that can be fulfilled only thanks to politics' specific clauses and limitations. Now let us come back to Levinas' Talmudic readings in general. The readings tell us an original story of politics. Politics, says the readings, originates in hunger and destitution. Resources are scarce or unevenly distributed. Life conditions are difficult and people need help, attention and support. People, namely the others, are poor by definition. Not in the sense that everyone around us is literally destitute, but in the sense that the others include people in need and that even the wealthiest and strongest may need comfort and care. People do things for and with other people, work for them, teach them, help them, and fight them. Hence, they have and will always have power over others. Power to hurt and power to heal. This is what Levinas meant when he says that the other is and will always be poor even in messianic times. The other are numerous, and we have our own families to feed. For this reason, and from the very beginning of human society, we establish contracts that stipulate the extent of our duties and limit our responsibility. There is need around us, but we cannot satisfy all of it. So we organize ourselves to satisfy some of it. We cannot treat everyone like King Solomon, but we can ensure everyone gets at least a small plate from Solomon's table. As such, the political contract is designed neither for the purposes of mutual security, as Hobbes would say, nor to establish the conditions for people to pursue their individual goals, as Locke would say, nor to establish the conditions for, nor even to ensure an equal distribution of power, as Rousseau would say. Rather, it constitutes the general effort to satisfy at least some part of everyone's needs. Thus, political institutions protect us against two dangers. The first is the risk of becoming so focused on the needs of some people that we forget the others. The contract limits our responsibility to any individual in order to allow for the care of a larger number. The second is the risk that, confronted by so much destitution, we will become blind to it. This can happen when so many people surround us that we become insensitive to others' needs. We retire into ourselves and begin to fear others instead of seeing them. For Levinas, therefore, the antinomic relationship between ethics and politics moderates both our responsibility and our indifference, as can be seen in another Talmudic text, Model of the West. In the Talmudic readings, Levinas uses the term justice for the antinomic relationship of ethics and politics. Levinas never clearly defines justice, and rarely even attempts to do so using concrete examples, by describing just procedure or just decisions. However, justice conceived in this way is not a value to be defined, but the relationship between ethics and politics. Ethics and politics never exist in pure forms, but are always opposed to each other in justice, namely in the relationship between infinite responsibility and the self-management of the community. in the Talmudic readings, justice has no fixed meaning or content. There is justice in all concrete situations, because justice is a ratio or measure of ethics and politics. Such justice is not non-violent. On the contrary, says Levinas, it is necessarily violent, because politics is based on law and rules, which by definition neglect or compromise individual needs in order to satisfy general ones. While this is the only way of ensuring that we satisfy at least some needs, some people get hurt in this process. They are unseen or unheard. To use Levinas' Talmudic metaphor, they sometimes need to be satisfied with simple meals, with bread and legumes only. In other words, says Levinas, justice creates dissatisfaction and sometimes pain, but there would be much more pain without it. Hence, the solutions to the problems of politics must be found in politics, while the principle behind these solutions, namely responsibility for the concrete needs of the people around us, transcends politics. To conclude, ethics for Levinas is the name of the principle by which the other has priority over the ego. However, as we see in the Talmudic readings, the number of others limits our ability to satisfy their immediate and infinite needs. The only way to appease some of these needs is through the practice of sharing and distributing responsibility and goods. That is, ethics calls for giving the other everything now. Through sharing and distribution, we can give the other something in a mediated way and in a postponed time. This practice is in itself unethical. Getting something at some point may sound less satisfying than the ethical everything now, but since the latter is impossible, from an ethical point of view, political mediation is the best we can have. This is certainly not to doubt or deny that politics can be a cause of hunger, of deprivation, of persecution. Politics indeed is both the origin and the cure of hunger. To put it differently, the Talmudic readings show that ethics alone has no materiality. It becomes material and receives meaning only in the form of something that is very different from and indeed opposed to it, politics. Note that this does not imply that politics is a compromise with reality and that an ideal world would be wholly ethical. Levinas does not imagine such an ideal world because it would be empty of people, except for the ego and the other, or in fact, except for the other alone, because the ego would have sacrificed himself or herself to the other. Ethics is the foundation of all relationships in the real world, the world we know, populated by many others, and political by essence. It is the principle of relationships in the political world, and politics is the performative of this principle, its material appearance in the world. The relationship between this principle and its performance is antinomic because by definition, the performance destroys the very formulation of the principle. Therefore, says Levinas, there can be no ethical politics, a politics that would in itself become ethical. But there can be a politics disturbed by ethics, reshaped by ethics, a politics aware of the ethical command, and which, by this awareness, makes ethics possible. Thank you very much.